Hello folks, here's hoping you're all very well. Slightly different video today. I made a video a few years back on cultural appropriation in terms of Celtic spirituality. And over the years I keep getting responses to that video, so it appears to be a topic that people are quite interested in. And you know, I can understand why people want to think about and talk about cultural appropriation, particularly if they are practicing a type of Celtic spirituality themselves. What does it all mean? Are we doing it wrong? Who's telling us off? Are we able to just do what we want to do? Well, it's a complex subject, and I feel like I need to update that video because the more I do this work, that is try and teach Celtic mythology and introduce people to actual Celtic sources, usually in translation, the more my own thinking about the whole situation has evolved over time. Consider that within Wales, for example, there's about 500,000 Welsh language speakers who use Welsh on a regular basis, that is. We're one of the healthiest Celtic languages surviving. And within that community of people, of Welsh speakers, we have a certain attitude to something like the four branches of the Mabinogi, let's say. One of our great cultural treasures. It's one of our classics. It's generally accepted that although they're not purely pagan, that there is a pagan root or a non-Christian root to these myths, even though they were written down roughly 900, 850 years ago, something like that. Now, in Welsh language education, most school kids will be taught at least one of the stories of the Mabinogi. And in Welsh language universities, there'll be several hundred people, if not, maybe I'm guessing 1,000 people at least every year, who will be exposed to the four branches of the Mabinogi. Outside of universities, you'll then have a minority of people who read Welsh literature, who have read the four branches and are familiar with them. But from all of those people in modern Welsh culture who have been exposed in some way to one of their own great cultural classics through the medium of Welsh, I'm guessing there's going to be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 times more people who have read the translation of the four branches of the Mabinogi in English. So for every one person who knows of and understands what the four branches is in Wales through the medium of Welsh, there's going to be a countless number outside of Welsh language culture who have experience of it, who have read it, who have written poems in response to it, who have created retellings of the four branches of the Mabinogi. So just think about that for a moment. There's far more people outside of Welsh language culture engaging with something like the four branches of the Mabinogi than there is inside Welsh culture. That means there's a greater diversity of opinion and engagement with the four branches as a translation than there is with the four branches as a Welsh text. Now, when you have something as intriguing and potent and mysterious and meaningful as the four branches of the Mabinogi, you're obviously going to have a whole range of different types of responses to it. Within Welsh language culture itself, the four branches is often used as like a springboard for poetry or for storytelling or for novel writing. There are loads of different examples within Welsh culture of poets in particular, modern poets, drawing on the four branches as raw material to create new poetry. But then when we look at how the four branches is being used outside of Welsh language culture, it's not only being used as the basis for retellings or reworkings by various fantasy authors in the modern period, it's also a significant text within what you might call modern paganism and modern druidry. And of course, modern pagans and modern druids outside of Wales now, or outside of Welsh language speaking culture, I should say, are drawn to the text because it does tell us something about the ancient beliefs of the Celts. Of course it does. It tells us something about the mythology of the Celts in the medieval period and how that mythology was rooted in an earlier, almost certainly Iron Age mythology. Obviously, we don't know what that Iron Age mythology was. We only have its evolved remains in the medieval period and medieval texts. Now, of course, neo-paganism, modern druidry, these are relatively established traditions in English-speaking culture, in what I would call the Anglo-American culture of Northwestern Europe and the Americas and Australia and New Zealand, all the places where English is the dominant language. And of course, there's far more use of the four branches of the Mabinogi in that culture than I would say there is within Welsh-speaking Wales itself. So the way that meaning is created around the four branches of the Mabinogi in our modern period happens on a much larger and much more diverse scale within Anglo-American paganism than it does within Welsh-speaking Wales itself. So the question arises, who gets to say what these stories mean, therefore? Do modern druids and neo-pagans ask Welsh speakers what their opinion on the four branches of the Mabinogi is? Not really. They've kind of run with it themselves. They've decided themselves what it means. They've decided themselves how these stories can be understood. Now, we could say that that is a type of cultural appropriation, okay? I'm not quite sure how I feel about that myself. I personally don't think there's anything wrong with experiencing other people's cultures. I don't think there's anything wrong with being influenced by other people's cultures, so long as we then don't go on to misrepresent and make claims about other people's cultures and basically their identities without checking in and asking themselves, first of all, well, is that really the case? Am I misrepresenting another people's culture? Am I misrepresenting another people's identity? And unfortunately, that does happen a lot. It just does. Now, I don't make it a habit to go and read books on modern paganism or modern druidry. I have my own understanding of my own native traditions within Wales and of comparable traditions in Ireland and Scotland and elsewhere. I have my own understanding of what the Celtic tradition on the whole means as a Welsh person. But when I have looked at books on modern druidry and paganism, there are many of them still to this day that are published that tend to misrepresent what the Celtic tradition actually does say and what it doesn't say. Now, part of that misrepresentation isn't in any way malevolent. It's not done out of spite. It's not done out of a colonialist attitude that we need to steal the cultural treasures of these Celts and make them our own. Haha. That's not the reason behind this type of misrepresentation. It's largely ignorance. But neither is it ignorance from stupidity. Most of these authors aren't dumb. They're not stupid. It's just that they're ignorant of, they don't have the information that they need to make a better representation of the Celtic tradition as they see it. And this is also complicated by the fact that for modern pagans, they believe in these myths. They have very often devotional relationships with Celtic gods and goddesses that they've identified in the source texts. They've seen other pagans, and historically for the last 200 years, approaching these myths in a certain way and saying things about these myths that fit their own beliefs. Now, of course, the matter of Celtic reconstructionism, of pagans trying to reconstruct exactly what Iron Age beliefs or early medieval beliefs actually looked like historically, is a subject all of its own. That's not really what I'm talking about here, because there is a camp within modern paganism that tries to be historically accurate as much as possible to what's actually known about the ancient Celts. But in terms of modern culture, there is a modern culture of belief that includes mistaken assumptions about what Celticness is. So we've got Imbolc coming up very soon. And Imbolc, of course, is a time of year where I would imagine almost all modern pagans would evoke Brigid, the goddess. And of course, when I say Brigid, I'm using an anglicised version of a name which appears in many different ways. In Ireland, we've got Brigid in Scots Gaelic, we've got Brigid, if I'm not mistaken. We've got Brigantia in the Iron Age in Britain, we've got Fried in Wales, all these different names for what we assume to be the same mythic figure, this Brigid. Now, when we look at the actual sources for Imbolc and Brigid in the Irish tradition, it's not clear whether the pre-Christian Brigid had anything to do with Imbolc. The figure that does have a connection with Imbolc is the Christian Saint Brigid, who most people assume to be a Christianized version of the earlier goddess. Now, that's not to say that the mythological Brigid of the earlier Irish pre-Christian tradition didn't have anything to do with Imbolc. It's just that we've got no evidence to say that that's the case. Now, some of you will have practice where you celebrate Brigid at Imbolc. And I don't want to invalidate that in any way. That is a valid and coherent practice all of its own. It has its own salience and meaning in your culture. I'm simply pointing out that in terms of the actual historical sources themselves, we just don't know if the earlier mythological Brigid was ever associated with Imbolc in that time of year, or whether that was something that happened within the Christian period, after Brigid had been absorbed into Christianity. We just don't know. I'm hoping for those of us who are sensible grown-up adults, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can understand two basic historical realities and still live with the ambiguity that they create. We can still have a viable, meaningful practice of spiritual devotion where Brigid is the goddess who celebrated it to Imbolc, while also appreciating the reality that we don't have any actual historical evidence for that. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that we can kind of make it fit in a certain way, but nowhere do we see the mythological Irish Brigid associated with Imbolc. It's the Saint Brigid of the Christian tradition who's associated with Imbolc. Now, I'm hoping that when you heard me say that, you didn't take it to mean that Brigid should not be celebrated at Imbolc. That is not what I said. I'm simply pointing out that the sources don't confirm that for us in Irish history. Now, this goes to the heart of my work and the reason for this channel, for Celtic Source, and for the various courses I've run over the years, for the websites, for everything I've done in a professional sense, if you like, when it comes to Celtic mythology. The whole point is to present the Celtic sources as we find them and to give people the opportunity to interpret them as they want to. Because the process of understanding history isn't just about gathering facts. It has to begin with gathering facts because we need to start with something certain. This is what the text actually says, and this text was written at this point in history, probably by these types of people. But after that, the interpretation of those historical facts and those texts is kind of still up in the air. So long as our interpretation doesn't contradict the facts of history, we can come to many, many different interpretations. This is why history isn't settled. This is why historians, academics in particular, still have jobs, because the facts of history still need to be interpreted. We still need to understand them. We still need to have a better understanding of the context they arise in, and we need to find ways of making them meaningful. Now, understanding history better is always a good thing in my mind. It means that we can come to better interpretations of our own, and ultimately that means that we can make these historical sources more meaningful to us living today. Now, I would say that you can still have a viable, legitimate, meaningful spiritual practice while also appreciating the ambiguities of Celtic history. I think that you can do both at the same time. But what it does mean is that we have to be far less dogmatic about what we think these things can mean. We have to be prepared to live in the mystery a little bit more. Now, this comes on to another related issue, which is who gets to say what these sources mean. Now, I would hope that most of you, if not all of you, would agree that the first people who have a claim to what these historical sources mean are Celtic peoples themselves. Surely people whose identities are tied up in these sources, basically Celtic speakers initially, and then non-Celtic language speakers who still consider themselves to be Celts, loads of Welsh people and Irish people and Scottish people and various other folks across the world are clearly Celtic in heritage, but they might not speak a Celtic language. It's all of those people who get to say what this stuff means first, I would say, yeah? And that's because what this stuff means has a direct impact on their identities, on their ethnicity, on how they think of themselves as a community of people, how they think of themselves as nations. So obviously there are political implications to what these Celtic sources mean. Our identities as peoples, as nations, as communities of language and culture is heavily impacted by the history of our traditions. How could it not be? Likewise, people outside of those groups, people who are not Celtic by language or heritage in any way, obviously if they're immersed in a Celtic mythology, albeit a modern one or a modern version or a modern reconstruction of one, clearly their identities are also tied up in this material. So obviously pagans and druids who have adopted these sources as religious texts in many instances, they are also invested in the integrity of these traditions and these sources and these texts. So I would say all of us together, we all have a vested interest in preserving the integrity of these Celtic sources. It's worth pointing out that the academic traditions of Wales and Ireland and elsewhere in the Celtic lands has for a very, very long time been a Christian tradition. So one of the reasons the Welsh language survives is because of the Christian non-conformist chapel culture of 250 years ago. Chapel goers, educated people who wandered around the countryside teaching people how to read the Bible in Welsh, how to read and write in Welsh, how to debate in Welsh, how to have an intellectual, educated life in Welsh. And these, of course, were largely working class communities. These weren't elitist in any sense. So that Christian culture has kept my language alive, and I would say that it's definitely had an impact elsewhere in the other Celtic nations also. But of course that Christian culture generally doesn't want to have anything to do with paganism. It's antithetical to that culture to consider the possibility that there were valid, significant, meaningful, non-Christian elements in culture. So when Welsh academia, or the Welsh literati is what you might call them, educated people who write books and who write papers and who teach in universities, these people have almost no interest whatsoever in historical paganism. They just don't. They don't want to know. They don't care. It's not on their radar, mainly because it's just not that important considered what else we've got to contend with as Welsh speakers. We are one of the healthiest populations of Celtic language speakers on the planet at the moment, but we still have significant cultural pressures from England and English-speaking culture. It's still a real struggle to remain a viable linguistic culture in Britain. It just is. And so things like historical paganism just aren't on the radar for many people. It's not on the list of priorities. There's also, I would say, still a certain distaste amongst nonconformist Welsh Christians in particular when it comes to things like historical paganism. There's a great deal of mistrust about what that means. Should we consider these folk beliefs and these ancient Celtic myths as the remnants of a dark and evil and demonic type of devil worship, of something bad, something that should have been stamped out and erased from history? That's still not so much a common attitude, but it's still there amongst the older folk for certain. Now, in terms of modern Welsh culture, there is a small but growing and vibrant community of Welsh-speaking pagans and Welsh pagans who don't speak Welsh, but who are still nonetheless Welsh and have as much claim and right to these materials as anyone else. That is a thing. But I find that culture is still heavily dominated by themes and attitudes and practices that have really been evolving in Anglo-American paganism for the last few centuries. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with that, because paganism, as far as I understand it, I'm not a pagan myself, as far as I understand it, it's focused on a search for the sacred. It's focused on finding sacredness and a connection to a form of the divine through various cultural sources. Yeah, that's what all religions are at the end of the day. And in that sense, that's what the focus is. The focus is on the sacred, on exploring that sense of the sacred. The focus is on the relationship with the divine. It's not necessarily on the historical sources themselves. And whereas those people who are drawn to various types of spirituality and religious life are drawn to that in particular, they don't necessarily have the time to go off and get PhDs in the Welsh Bardic tradition, or or study the Mabinogi University, what have you. But for that reason, I think it is the responsibility of those of us who do have some experience in those fields to present the Celtic sources in as neutral a way as we can, and to point out what these ancient Celtic sources tell us and what they don't tell us, so that people can make up their own minds about what it is that they want to believe in. Because that's one of the great strengths of modern paganism, in my opinion, is the fact that it's so anarchic. It doesn't necessarily have a hierarchy. It's got thought leaders, to use a modern phrase. So even though there are many books and authors, and by today's loads of YouTube channels that will give you the easy answers as to what this stuff means, I don't think the answers should be easy, unfortunately. I think that we should be far more comfortable with ambiguity, and that we should be saying we don't know far more than we do. It's convenient to have someone telling you that there is a simple, easy answer to what this text means, or to who this god or goddess is, or as to what this myth means. It's really convenient and easy to live in that way, and I totally understand in other areas of life where I have no expertise, I'm exactly the same. When it comes to politics, or when it comes to economics, or any other field that requires a certain expertise to fully understand, I'm just like everybody else. So I get it, I understand it. But I do encourage people who are drawn to the Celtic myths, drawn to the Celtic sources, to appreciate that what's often presented to us through modern pagan culture doesn't correspond that neatly to what the Celtic source texts are always telling us. And to be okay with ambiguity, to be okay with we don't know, to be okay with the possibility that what you once thought was the historical reality turns out to not be the case. Because if one thing's for certain, we want to pass these Celtic sources on as cleanly and with as much integrity as we can, so that future generations could come to their own conclusions as to what they mean, so that future generations have the opportunity to interpret them for themselves. So that's my tuppenny's worth. I hope that all made sense to you. I'll be back to making videos in the office soon enough, I'm sure. But there you go. Hope you're all well. Take care. Will out.